Have you ever felt that strange sensation when you're grieving alone? That peculiar feeling that somehow, somewhere, you're not actually alone in your sorrow. There's a reason for that feeling, a profound truth that transcends our physical understanding of death and separation. When tears fall silently down your cheeks in those private moments of grief, something remarkable is happening beyond the veil that separates our world from what lies beyond. You are never truly alone in your grief. Even when no human eyes witness your pain, someone on the other side feels every tear you shed. This isn't just poetic comfort or wishful thinking. According to spiritual researchers and those who've studied consciousness beyond physical death, the bonds we form with our loved ones don't simply vanish when their physical bodies cease functioning. Instead, these connections transform, operating on levels that our limited physical senses cannot perceive. Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet, documented thousands of readings that explored this connection. Through his work, a consistent message emerged. Consciousness continues after physical death, and the emotional bonds between souls remain intact, sometimes growing even stronger without physical limitations. Death is merely a transition from the physical world to the spiritual world, Cayce explained in one of his most profound readings. The soul continues its journey, maintaining awareness of those left behind, particularly when strong emotional bonds exist. But what does this actually mean for you when you're experiencing the raw, overwhelming pain of losing someone you love? It means that your grief doesn't go unwitnessed. Your tears aren't falling into an empty void. Your words, whether spoken aloud or merely thought in the silence of your breaking heart, aren't lost to nothingness. The truth is both comforting and challenging to comprehend. Your loved ones who have passed can sense your emotional state. They witness your grief. They feel your longing. The veil between worlds becomes thinnest when emotions run deepest. Scientists like Carl Sagan approach the universe with wonder and skepticism, teaching us to demand extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. Yet even rational minds must contend with the vast amount of cross-cultural documentation of consciousness continuing beyond physical death. The patterns are too consistent, the testimonies too numerous to dismiss entirely. Consider for a moment what this means. When you sit alone in your bedroom, clutching a photograph of someone you've lost, overwhelmed by waves of grief that feel like they might drown you, you are not experiencing that pain in isolation. The very person whose absence causes your suffering is present in ways our limited understanding struggles to comprehend. This isn't to say they hover around us constantly, bound to earth by our attachment. Rather, according to spiritual teachings across multiple traditions, they exist in a different state of consciousness, one that allows them to perceive emotional energies in ways that transcend physical limitations. The connections between souls, one Cayce reading states, are not subject to physical laws or limitations. They operate on principles that exist beyond time and space as we understand them. Grief researchers have documented countless accounts of bereaved individuals who report sensing the presence of their deceased loved ones. These experiences happen across cultures, religious backgrounds, and belief systems. They occur to skeptics and believers alike. Something universal seems to be happening in these moments, something that suggests our conventional understanding of death may be incomplete. What if, in those moments when grief feels most overwhelming, when you feel most alone in your pain, you are actually experiencing a profound, if unseen, reunion? What if your tears create ripples that extend beyond the physical world, touching the consciousness of those you miss most desperately? The most remarkable aspect of this understanding is how it transforms our perception of grief itself. Rather than seeing grief as merely the painful price we pay for having loved someone we've lost, we might begin to recognize it as something more profound, a continuation of connection, a form of communication that transcends physical limitations. So what happens on the other side when you grieve? How do our departed loved ones experience our sorrow? And how might understanding this change the way we approach our own grief journey? When we talk about what happens on the other side, we're venturing into territory that requires us to set aside our physical world assumptions. According to Cayce's readings and numerous spiritual traditions, consciousness after physical death exists in a fundamentally different relationship with time, space, and perception. So what exactly do our loved ones experience when we grieve for them? The answer might surprise you. First and foremost, they don't perceive our grief as we experience it. While we feel the crushing weight of absence, the empty chair at the dinner table, the voice that no longer answers the phone, they experience our emotions more directly, without these physical associations. The soul that has passed, Cayce explained in reading 57564, perceives not through physical senses, but through vibrational attunement. They sense emotional states rather than physical actions. This means they don't see our tears in the conventional sense. They feel the emotional energy behind them. This perspective shift is crucial to understanding the connection. When you break down in tears, clutching their photograph late at night, they don't witness this scene as if watching a movie. Instead, they become aware of the pure emotional energy you're releasing. They feel the love that makes your grief possible in the first place. Many spiritual traditions describe this awareness as instantaneous and unbound by distance. In the non-physical realms, consciousness doesn't require time to travel from point A to point B. When you think of your loved one intensely, that thought creates an immediate connection, like a quantum entanglement of souls. Thought is the builder, was one of Cayce's most frequently repeated insights. In the context of grief, this suggests that our thoughts about those who've passed create immediate bridges between realms of existence. Perhaps most comforting is what Cayce and other spiritual sources tell us about how our loved ones respond to our grief. Rather than being distressed by our pain, they understand it from a broader perspective. They recognize the love underlying our sorrow, and they attempt to communicate comfort back to us. This response often manifests in subtle ways: a sudden warm feeling, an unexpected memory surfacing, a dream visitation, or synchronicities that seem too meaningful to be coincidence. These are what many spiritual traditions describe as attempts by those who've passed to acknowledge our grief and offer comfort. However, there's another dimension to this interaction that's rarely discussed. According to several of Cayce's readings, excessive grief can sometimes create difficulties for those who've passed. When grief becomes all-consuming and prolonged, it can create what he described as ties or bonds that make it challenging for the soul to fully transition to its next phase of existence. Grief that refuses to release, reading 3954-1 suggests, can create an emotional tether that divides the attention of the soul that has passed. This doesn't mean we shouldn't grieve. Rather, it suggests that there is a natural evolution to healthy grief that eventually integrates loss into a new form of connection. This brings us to a profound paradox. The very act of grieving creates both connection and potential limitation. Our tears simultaneously reach across the veil and can, if we become stuck in grief, create constraints for those we love. Many who've studied Cayce's work suggest this is why we often experience a shift in how we feel our connection to loved ones as time passes. Initially, in the raw stages of grief, we might feel their presence intensely, sometimes even physically sensing them near us. As grief transforms, not diminishes, but transforms, this connection often changes quality, becoming less about absence and more about a continuing bond that acknowledges their ongoing journey. The purpose of existence, Cayce reminded us repeatedly, is growth toward greater awareness of our divine nature. This growth doesn't end with physical death. In fact, many spiritual teachings suggest it accelerates. Our loved ones continue their soul's journey, even as they maintain awareness of and connection to us. Understanding this dimension of what happens when we grieve can transform how we approach the process. Rather than seeing grief as a purely personal experience, something that happens entirely within us, we might recognize it as a form of communication, a bridge between worlds that serves purposes we're only beginning to comprehend. When grief wraps itself around your heart, the physical world often feels hollow, devoid of meaning, color, or purpose. Yet this is precisely when many people report experiencing unusual phenomena that defy logical explanation. According to Cayce's readings and countless testimonials, these aren't coincidences or products of a grief-stricken imagination. They're actual attempts at communication from the other side. The soul that has passed, reading 3954-2 explains, often seeks to reassure those left behind through impressions, symbols, and subtle influences on the physical environment. These communications don't arrive as clearly as a phone call or text message. Instead, they manifest through channels that don't require physical voice or form. The first, and perhaps most common sign, comes through dreams. Cayce emphasized that during sleep, our consciousness naturally shifts to frequencies that more closely align with non-physical realms. This creates an ideal bridge for communication. Dream visits from loved ones who've passed often share distinct characteristics. They feel unusually vivid, emotionally powerful, and different from ordinary dreams. The deceased typically appears healthy, at peace, and communicates messages of reassurance. In the dream state, Cayce noted, the soul is freed from many physical limitations, allowing for more direct communion with those who have passed. These aren't merely comforting fantasies, they're genuine meetings in a shared consciousness space. Another frequent sign comes through symbolic appearances of birds, butterflies, or other animals that seem to behave in unusual ways. A cardinal that refuses to leave your window, a butterfly that circles you repeatedly, or an animal that was significant to your loved one appearing unexpectedly. These may be more than random wildlife encounters. Reading 57568 suggests that souls can temporarily influence the behavior of animals, using them as messengers when direct communication isn't possible. The natural world becomes a messenger service between realms of existence. Electrical phenomena represent another common category of signs. Lights flickering without explanation, electronic devices turning on or off, or songs that were significant to your relationship playing unexpectedly on the radio. These electrical anomalies often spike during periods of intense grief or on dates significant to your relationship with the person who's passed. Discarnate entities, Cayce explained, can more easily influence electrical fields than solid matter, as electricity exists at the boundary between physical and non-physical reality. This makes electrical devices particularly effective channels for communication attempts. Perhaps the most powerful signs come through what many describe as a sudden, overwhelming sense of presence. This isn't imagined company. It's a tangible feeling that your loved one is literally beside you, often accompanied by physical sensations, a touch on your shoulder, the scent of their perfume or cologne, or a rush of warmth in an otherwise cool room. According to reading 57564, the soul can temporarily create sensory impressions that the physical body can detect, although these require significant energy and typically last only moments. These brief sensory communications often arrive precisely when grief feels most overwhelming, serving as timely reassurance. Synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that defy statistical probability, form another category of communication. Finding objects connected to your loved one at pivotal moments, repeatedly encountering their name or birth date, or receiving messages through strangers that somehow contain information only you and the deceased would understand. These coincidences often carry the distinct signature of intentional communication. What appears as chance, Cayce reminded us, is often the result of influences and forces beyond physical perception. Omsto. When these meaningful coincidences cluster around periods of intense grief, they suggest purposeful contact rather than random events. What's particularly notable about these signs is their timing. They frequently occur during critical emotional thresholds, the first major holiday without your loved one, anniversaries, birthdays, or moments when grief suddenly resurfaces with unexpected intensity. This timing suggests awareness and response from the other side, an active participant in the ongoing relationship rather than a passive memory. However, Cayce's readings also caution against becoming overly fixated on signs or attempting to force communication. The soul must be allowed its journey, reading 3954 her 6 advisors, and communication should flow naturally rather than through demand or obsession. This balanced approach honors both the continuing bond and the ongoing journey of the soul that has passed. Understanding these signs transforms grief from a one-sided experience of loss into a dynamic, evolving relationship. Your tears, your spoken words to an empty room, your internal conversations with someone who's no longer physically present, these aren't exercises in futility, or signs of inability to accept reality. They're genuine interactions in a relationship that continues in altered form. This perspective doesn't diminish grief or suggest we shouldn't feel the pain of physical separation. Rather, it enriches our understanding of what grief actually is. Not just an internal emotional response to loss, but part of an ongoing dialogue with those who've transitioned to a different form of existence. The most profound revelation about grief may be this: it isn't merely something to endure or overcome, it's potentially a sacred doorway to deeper spiritual connection. When understood and approached with awareness, grief can evolve from a crushing weight into a bridge between worlds, benefiting both the living and those who have passed. Grief transformed becomes not an end, Cayce explained in reading 5756:12, but a beginning, the start of a new form of relationship that transcends physical limitations. This transformation doesn't mean forgetting or moving on in the conventional sense. Instead, it involves integrating the loss into a new understanding of connection that acknowledges both absence and presence simultaneously. The key to this transformation lies in conscious intention. When we grieve unconsciously, trapped in loops of pain without awareness, we may inadvertently create what Cayce called binding ties, emotional tethers that can actually restrict the journey of the soul that has passed. However, when we bring awareness to our grief process, something remarkable happens. The same emotional energy that could restrict can instead elevate both parties. The highest form of love, reading 39.549 suggests, releases even as it connects. This paradoxical wisdom points to a grief practice that many have found transformative, consciously releasing our loved ones to their continued journey while simultaneously acknowledging the continuing bond. This practice often begins with a simple but powerful shift in how we direct our thoughts during moments of intense grief. Rather than focusing exclusively on absence and loss, we can intentionally include gratitude for the continuing connection and explicit permission for the soul's ongoing evolution. A practical approach might involve creating regular times for conscious connection, not just remembering the person who has passed, but actively engaging with their continuing presence. This might include setting aside quiet moments to speak directly to your loved one, sharing your life updates just as you would in a conversation, creating small rituals on significant dates that celebrate connection rather than just marking loss, journaling about ongoing communications and synchronicities, creating a record of continuing relationship, expressing gratitude for specific ways their influence continues in your life. Communication, Cayce reminded us in reading 5756:14, flows most clearly through channels of gratitude and love rather than despair. This suggests that our emotional state actually affects the clarity of connection between realms. Perhaps most revolutionary is what this understanding reveals about the purpose of grief itself. Far from being merely a painful consequence of attachment, grief may actually serve as a vital evolutionary mechanism for consciousness, a process that transforms relationships rather than ending them. Many who have studied Cayce's work suggest that grief creates something like a quantum entanglement between souls, a connection that transcends physical limitations and continues to evolve as both parties grow. Your grief doesn't hold your loved one back when approached consciously. Instead, it creates new possibilities for mutual growth and understanding. The boundaries between worlds, reading 395411 explains, become most permeable when approached with conscious awareness and love. This permeability allows for ongoing exchange between the physical and non-physical realms, an exchange that enriches both. This perspective also explains why grief often arrives in waves rather than as a steady state, and why these waves frequently coincide with moments when we sense our loved ones most strongly. These intensifications may represent actual communications, moments when the connection between realms strengthens temporarily, allowing for exchange between different states of consciousness. The most practical application of this knowledge involves approaching grief as a form of active communication rather than passive suffering. When tears come, we might recognize them not just as expressions of pain, but as messages that actually reach those we miss. When we speak to loved ones who have passed, we might understand that these aren't just therapeutic monologues, but genuine dialogues occurring across different frequencies of existence. What you perceive as absence, Cayce noted, is often merely a shift in perception rather than an actual separation. This insight invites us to develop new sensitivities, to become aware of presence that doesn't register through our physical senses, but nonetheless influences our consciousness in tangible ways. The ultimate revelation may be that grief itself is evidence of something science is only beginning to comprehend. Consciousness exists beyond the physical brain, and relationships continue beyond physical death. Your grief isn't delusional attachment to something that has ended. It's recognition of a connection that continues in transformed ways. This doesn't mean grief shouldn't hurt, or that pain indicates spiritual failure. The physical separation is real, and the longing for physical presence is natural and appropriate. But beneath that longing lies a profound truth. What we love in others isn't limited to their physical form, and connection transcends the boundaries we perceive with our limited senses. The greatest comfort, reading 5756:16 concludes, comes not from belief in continuation, but from direct experience of it. This suggests that grief, when approached consciously, eventually yields to first-hand knowledge, not just hope or faith, but actual recognition of continuing relationship. Perhaps this is why, across time and cultures, those who have grieved deeply often describe a surprising evolution. The crushing pain gradually transforms into a quiet certainty of ongoing connection. What begins as desperate longing often matures into peaceful recognition that love continues its work across the boundaries between worlds. Your tears are never wasted. Your conversations with empty rooms are never unheard. Your love never disappears into nothingness. The truth about what your loved ones see when you grieve is this: they see you, they respond to you, and the relationship continues. Different, yes, but unbroken by what we call death. If you've ever felt that invisible connection with someone you've lost, know that you're not alone. Your experiences matter, and I'd love to hear them. Share your story in the comments below. What signs have you received? How has your understanding of grief evolved? If this perspective brought you comfort, please hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss our explorations of life's deepest mysteries. Your subscription helps us continue creating content that bridges science, spirituality, and human experience. Remember, understanding grief doesn't just ease our pain, it transforms our relationship with those we love beyond the veil. Until next time, may you find peace in knowing that love truly transcends all boundaries.